But we're now going to move over to Pierre Brouard, and they will be presenting on borders and boundaries, trans-allyship in a university setting. That will also reflect some hopeful thoughts after the previous presentation. Thanks, Pierre.
Thanks, Chris. I hope you haven't set me up there. Let me start my presentation. Give me a second. So thank you very much for inviting me to present today. Can you hear me okay?
Very well. Thanks, Pierre.
Thanks, Chris. I think one of the threads that I've observed through the symposium this morning is the question of who gets to speak for trans and gender diverse people. And their questions have arisen around cultural competence and cultural safety. So I think my presentation perhaps is pertinent because obviously trans and gender diverse people live in relation to systems of power and exclusion. And so I think it's quite valid to ask, is it ever possible for an ally to speak for a trans and gender diverse person? And what are some of the politics and challenges around that? So I'm based at the Centre for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender at the University of Pretoria. I'm also a member of the executive of the Sexuality and Gender Division of SAISA. And I'm going to be exploring the question of trans allyship in relation to my particular university. I'm laughing because my slide won't move. The joys of technology. Let me try something different. Stop sharing. I may need to share my slides without using full screen, if that's okay.
100%, Pierre.
Except, there we go. So the points I want to make here in my presentation is that allyship is always fraught, and trans allyship in particular comes with its own challenges. So I share my own experiences of allyship in working with the trans protocol and taking it through a process of adoption and socialization at my university. And I describe this as an imperfect exercise to show what's possible and what indeed may be missing in this work. And I use the ideas of borders and boundaries. In thinking about the session today, I found a publication which looked at allyship, a guide to being a trans ally. And what struck me about this slide was the idea of allyship as a continuum, and that being guaranteed or accepted as an ally is not necessarily an outcome, even if you decide that you yourself are an ally. And the publication went on to describe different barriers to allyship, ways in which, for example, barrier 3, the ally may be well-intentioned, or the ally may be unwilling to take on difficult issues, or they may overstep their boundaries. So it struck me in thinking about this that allyship is a contested and tricky terrain. Looking at the university context, I think this is something we're all familiar with, that they are not welcoming often to people who are diverse in terms of gender identity or expression. They're often cisnormative and heteronormative, and they're not necessarily welcoming and accepting to trans and gender diverse people. I don't believe all of this is intentionally antagonistic. It often comes from a place of misinformation and assumptions around gender. But the default of many of our university and other institutional spaces is that they are cis-het. And so this is the environment into which trans and gender diverse people step. So I think it's reasonable to argue that there is a need for policies and transformation work, which is informed by a queer intersectional frame to make those spaces more welcoming and inclusive. So the actual spark for the trans protocol at UP was a trans male student who approached me about 4 years or so ago, He was in the process of transitioning, but he hadn't yet achieved the final legal name changes, but he felt that he wasn't safe in our university and wanted some assurance from me and my center about what we could do to support him in his university life in a way that he felt it was dignified and recognized the journey that he was on. But there was an institutional silence around gender, although our anti-discrimination policy does explicitly talk about gender identity, and gender expression. But like a lot of policies, there's a naming of an idea, but there isn't expression or explication on how it could be taken further. So the trans protocol was formally, after about a 4 or 5 year process, adopted as part of our anti-discrimination policy as a guideline to respond to the needs of trans and gender diverse staff and students. And many stakeholders in many years were involved in this process, and I named some of them here. And ultimately, the protocol had to be reviewed by faculty transformation committees, then it had to go through our institutional transformation committee, and finally, it was adopted by the executive. And the broader aim is to eradicate discrimination, but also to build an inclusive and affirming environment. So it wasn't so much only about addressing harm, but also doing the groundwork to prevent harm. So what does the protocol cover? It sets out, explains terminology and explains the rationale for the work. It describes forms of transitioning and sets out ideas for faculties and departments to manage this. It describes how support can be offered, how parts of the university can do anti-stigma work. It explains ways to manage name and other changes. And in fact, subsequently, the Vice-Chancellor sent out an instruction that students should be allowed to identify in terms of name, gender pronouns, etc., on all the IT systems that they interact with. So that was an important step forward. And it sets out an intention to develop more gender-neutral bathrooms and asks questions, but doesn't provide solutions for questions of residence allocation and access. Those are complicated questions, and I suppose something we could debate is whether something like a protocol of this nature can set out explicit steps such as this, or does it create an enabling framework for those conversations to start? It also starts a conversation about, with staff, about how we can recognize diversity and challenge binaries, and to get departments and centers and units to start the conversation now about gender diversity before someone inside that particular space may announce that they are transitioning. It takes very much a prevention focus, not just a harm focus. And I think it could be argued that it's in a form of emboldening, because when you have a specific document such as this, people feel that it starts to give a framework for them to claim their rights. And some of the things that people can do around that are informed by the trans protocol would be, and we've suggested this to all faculties, is to reach out to your faculty community and talk about things like titles and pronouns and names in official communications, to get that conversation going and to make it possible for people to self-identify. To address the challenges of binary language, I think is something very important to do. To look at how we use language in official documents. Often they require sex and gender in forms, but sometimes there are opportunities to invite people to self-identify. Sometimes we just default to the idea that forms must require binary information when in fact it's not a requirement. We think lecturers and researchers should start to think about curricula and research agendas to challenge their binary assumptions. We think that the protocol can start a conversation about the ideas of gender performance. How do lecturers engage with their classes in terms of language and how they respond to people in the room who might be gender diverse? And then to engage in discussions around things such as transitioning and how stigma and discrimination can be averted. So I think the protocol, it creates a possibility for these kinds of considerations and conversations. And indeed, I think what the protocol should do, and I hope that it started to do this, is to challenge the hidden curriculum of cisnormativity, which is part of all of our institutional cultures. And then where possible, of course, and this goes more to my question I'm asking today, is that people who are gender diverse should themselves lead these conversations and not be spoken for. Some further outcomes, very briefly, the Vice-Chancellor has met with trans and gender activists. The law faculty has developed a microsite with resources and information. There have been engagements that I've conducted with another colleague, with student advisors, student counseling, employee wellness programs, about how they can support trans and gender diverse members of our community. I know that the theology faculty has started to bring the protocol into its gender curriculum. And as Landa alluded to earlier this morning, the bursary department of our university has been engaging with me and our transformation office about how to make bursary application process more inclusive. And I think a lot of this is enabled by the protocol. So where does allyship fit into this? In post-colonial studies and critical theory, the word subaltern is an interesting one to work with because it designates and identifies originally colonial populations who were socially, politically, and geographically excluded from power. And I would argue that trans and gender diverse people are often excluded from the hierarchies of power in their institutional spaces. And often then it's allies who work with issues around trans and gender diversity who themselves do have power. And having that power and that positionality and privilege means that it's possible they don't fully understand what it's like to exist in the subaltern position. So allyship can thus be described always as a becoming and perhaps never 100% satisfactory. I recently attended an online queer book launch and some of the participants reflected on allyship. And it struck me that the way that the conversation was happening, that allyship seemed to be presented as elusive and the ability of the ally to achieve full allyship almost impossible. And thinking about that subsequently, wearing my psychologist cap, I wondered if this was a way for people who've experienced the fear of discrimination and harm, who mistrust the cisgender institutional spaces and have been exploited and harmed, that holding allyship as elusive is a way of holding on to and reclaiming a sense of power. I think one of the challenges in this is that it can immobilize the ally and cause them to abandon their efforts. So contestation is an inevitable aspect of this work, and Verloor and van der Vleuten talk about many contestations in the world of trans politics and trans organizing. For example, between state and non-state actors, between trans people and, as we've heard today, medical professionals, but also among and between social movements. And many of you in this room today will be very familiar with these. So the space is contested. Hannah Lee Johnson offers what I think are two interesting ideas to improve trans allyship. She talks about an ethic of responsible listening, which is about opening up spaces for trans voices to be heard and responded to based on an obligation. There's a duty there to have a dialogue that recognizes trans people as people. And then she talks about the idea of ally labor, which is a set of practices that do not have a guaranteed outcome, but that aim always to benefit trans lives. And particularly she talks about how cis people should leverage their privilege to enable trans people to better navigate systems of oppression. So I offer the idea of imperfect allyship as an idea that meets two different needs. Firstly, the need for the subaltern or the marginalized person to have their mistrust validated and acknowledged, noting that trust is always a precarious feeling. And then secondly, the need for the ally, the person in the position of privilege, to be humbly good enough, but noting that they can never be perfect. So I would argue that imperfect allyship stands on the border between trying hard to be a good ally, but accepting you may not always get it right, but accepting that allies may be necessary, this is from the subaltern position, but that we remain healthily skeptical of their motives and methods. Perhaps the way forward is honesty, transparency, reflexivity, and a willingness to keep communication open. So in my own reflexivity around the trans protocol, and I'm just have one or two more slides now, I feel I could have worked harder to bring more trans people into the process beyond the ones that I did. I think not all trans people speak for other trans people. I think I could have worked harder for certain tangible gains and specific commitments rather than the compromises I had to accept. And I think I could have worked harder to think about intersectional categories of race, class, and ability, among others, because I think, trans people obviously are not one thing, and that many of these other variables intersect with different trans experiences and stories. So in theory, I've come from a place of privilege, but I've also come to think about my own social positioning as more insecure around this question, because although I don't formally identify as trans, I don't feel entirely cisgender either. And in fact, I have repeated experiences in the world of being misgendered. So that's an interesting journey for me to experience that sort of othering or questioning, I suppose, that can happen. And it's forced me into the position of asking how indeed I do identify. And I think I've been able to quite usefully translate that questioning, not only questioning aimed at me, but questioning as part of my own internal journey into my trans allyship work. So perhaps I'm in the sense, I'm on the cusp in terms of gender identity and appearance. I can bring this into my own work and accept that my own allyship in its imperfectness may be good enough. So the question of Winnicott came up earlier. Jonathan, you talked about it in terms of some of your work. You talked about Winnicott. He also talked about good enough parenting, which is the idea that parents can never meet entirely the needs of their children, although they must aspire to in the beginning, certainly, but that it's important for the child to learn that the world isn't perfect. So perhaps what I can leave you with as I conclude my presentation is to think about allyship not in a one-dimensional way, that sometimes we assume people have privilege, but it's possible that they bring other stories to their own allyship. So I leave you with the question, is it acceptable to agree on an idea of good enough allyship, or is this a step too far? Thank you very much.